The sun had set hours ago, and the full moon was shining bright in the sky, casting eerie shadows on the abandoned street. Sarah walked down the empty road, her heart racing with fear as she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She quickly turned around, but there was no one there. As she continued to walk, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She picked up her pace, but the footsteps grew louder, and she knew that she was no longer alone. Sarah reached the old, decrepit building that she had been told to go to, and hesitated for a moment before finally pushing open the door. The sound of creaking hinges filled the air, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The inside of the building was dark and musty, and Sarah struggled to see in the dim light. She had a faint sound coming from the other side of the room, and she froze, her hand reaching for the flashlight she had brought with her. As she shined the light in the direction of the noise, she saw a figure standing in the shadows, and she screamed, dropping the flashlight and running back towards the door. But as she reached for the handle, she realized that it was locked. She was trapped, and the figure was slowly moving closer, its eyes glowing in the dark. Sarah realized with a growing sense of horror that she was in grave danger, and she had to find a way out before it was too late. Sarah backed away from the door, her eyes fixed on the figure as it stepped out of the shadows. It was a tall, thin man, dressed in ragged clothes, with long, tangled hair and a blank, expressionless face. She tried to remember the self-defense techniques she had learned, but her mind was racing and she felt paralyzed with fear. The man took another step closer, and she could smell the stench of decay coming from him. Suddenly, she remembered the knife she had brought with her, and she reached for it, her hand shaking as she tried to grip it tightly. The man lunged at her, and she plunged the knife into his chest, feeling a sickening sense of satisfaction as it made contact. But to her horror, the man didn't stop. He continued to advance, and she realized with a growing sense of despair that the knife had had no effect. She stumbled backwards, tripping over a pile of rubble and falling to the ground. As she lay there, the man stood over her, his eyes glowing with an evil, unearthly light. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing herself for the end, but the expected blow never came. When she opened her eyes again, the man was gone. Shaken and confused, Sarah struggled to her feet, still clutching the knife. She realized that she had to find a way out of the building, but as she took her first step, she heard a voice whisper her name. It was a voice she recognized, but couldn't place. And as she spun around to face it, she realized with a growing sense of terror that she was no longer alone in the dark and abandoned building. Sarah turned towards the source of the voice, her heart racing as she saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in a white dress that was tattered and stained, her hair long and tangled. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The woman took a step forward, and Sarah saw that her eyes were as black as the darkness around them. "I am the one who has been watching you," the woman said, her voice a low whisper. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, and she tightened her grip on the knife. "What do you want from me?" The woman took another step forward, and Sarah saw that her face was deathly pale, her skin stretched tight over her bones. "I want you to join me," she said, reaching out a bony hand towards Sarah. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she had to find a way out of the building, but she was trapped, with no escape from the horrors that surrounded her. She had a sound behind her, and she spun around, the knife at the ready. But there was no one there, and she realized with a growing sense of desperation that she was completely alone. As she stood there, the darkness closing in around her, she realized with a growing sense of terror that she was no longer sure if she was awake or asleep, alive or dead. And as the fear overtook her, she knew that she was lost in a nightmare from which she may never awaken. Sarah felt herself start to panic, her breaths coming in short gasps. She tried to calm herself, telling herself that it was all just a nightmare, that she was safe. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She heard a sound from one of the other rooms, and she slowly made her way towards it, her hand clutching the knife tightly. As she entered the room, she saw a figure standing in the corner, its back to her. Sarah approached cautiously, ready to defend herself if necessary. As she got closer, she saw that it was a man, his head hanging low. She reached out a hand to touch his shoulder, and he suddenly turned to face her. His eyes were black and empty, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones. Sarah screamed and stumbled back, her hand tightening around the knife. The man advanced on her, and she realized with a growing sense of horror that he was one of the dead, risen from the grave to torment the living. She tried to fend him off with the knife, but he was too strong, and she soon found herself overpowered. As he closed in on her, she realized with a sense of despair that she was going to die, that the nightmare was never going to end. Just as the man was about to grab her, there was a flash of light, and Sarah saw that the woman in white was standing between them, her arms outstretched as if to protect her. "You must leave this place," she said, her voice a low whisper. "The dead are not to be disturbed." Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, her feet pounding on the floor as she made her escape. And as she ran, she knew that she was running not just from the horrors that haunted the abandoned building, but from the fear that was consuming her soul. Sarah ran down the hallway, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew that she had to keep moving, that she had to get as far away from the building as possible. She heard a sound behind her, and she spun around, the knife at the ready. But there was no one there, and she realized with a growing sense of unease that she was being followed. She continued to run, her feet pounding on the floor, but the sound got louder and closer. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run any further, she burst through a door and into the night. She collapsed on the ground, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She felt a sense of relief wash over her, knowing that she was finally free from the horrors that haunted the building. But as she lay there, she heard a voice whisper her name. She looked up and saw the woman in white standing over her. "You are not free," the woman said, her voice a low whisper. "The dead are everywhere, and they will never let you go." Sarah felt a sense of terror grip her, and she struggled to her feet, the knife at the ready. She knew that she had to get as far away from the building as possible, that she had to find safety before the dead caught up to her. She turned and ran, not daring to look back. And as she ran, she knew that she was running not just from the horrors that haunted the abandoned building, but from the fear that was consuming her soul. Sarah ran through the streets, her breaths coming in short gasps. She had no idea where she was, but she knew that she had to keep moving, that she had to find help. She stumbled upon a small convenience store, and she rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind her. She leaned against the door, her heart pounding in her chest, as she looked around for a phone to call for help. She saw a figure in the corner, and she spun around, the knife at the ready. But it was only the store clerk, who looked at her with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Please, I need to use your phone," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Something's after me." The store clerk hesitated for a moment, but then handed her the phone. Sarah dialed 911 and explained her situation to the operator. Within minutes, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, and she knew that help was on the way. But as she waited for the police to arrive, she heard a voice whisper her name. She spun around and saw the woman in white standing in the doorway, her arms outstretched as if to grab her. "You cannot escape the dead," the woman said, her voice a low whisper. "They are everywhere, and they will never let you go." Sarah screamed and backed away, her hand tightening around the knife. The store clerk tried to grab her, but she shook him off and ran towards the door, determined to get as far away from the building as possible. She burst through the door and into the night, her feet pounding on the pavement as she ran. And as she ran, she knew that she was running not just from the horrors that haunted the abandoned building, but from the fear that was consuming her soul. Sarah ran down the street, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the sound of the woman in white's voice echoing in her head, telling her that she couldn't escape the dead. She stumbled upon an old church and went inside, hoping to find solace and refuge from the horrors that were pursuing her. The church was dark and quiet, the only sound the soft whisper of prayers from the few people scattered throughout the pews. Sarah went to the front of the church, and she knelt down in front of the altar, her hands clasped together in prayer. She closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, trying to calm her racing heart. Suddenly, she had a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, coming closer and closer, and she knew that the woman in white had found her. She looked up, and she saw the woman standing at the end of the aisle, her arms outstretched as if to grab her. Sarah screamed and backed away, her hand tightening around the knife. But as she looked into the woman's eyes, she saw not malice or hatred, but sadness and regret. The woman whispered something that Sarah couldn't quite make out, and then she vanished into thin air. Sarah sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Was it all just her imagination? Had she finally lost her mind? Just then, she heard the soft whisper of a voice, and she turned to see an old priest standing behind her. "Do not fear," he said, his voice gentle and reassuring. "You have been given a gift of being able to see beyond this world, to see the things that others cannot." Sarah looked at the priest, not understanding what he was saying. But as she looked into his eyes, she felt a sense of peace wash over her, and she knew that she was going to be okay. Sarah was still trying to make sense of what the priest had told her when she heard the sound of sirens outside the church. She ran to the door and saw police cars pulling up in front of the church, their blue and red lights flashing in the darkness. She turned to the priest, fear in her eyes. "What's happening?" she asked. "The dead have risen," the priest said simply. "They are here, and they are coming for you." Sarah didn't have time to process what he was saying before the doors of the church burst open, and the dead stumbled into the church, their eyes locked onto her. She screamed and backed away, her hand clutching the knife. The priest stepped forward, his hand raised in blessing, and the dead seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if they were afraid of him. But then, the dead rushed forward, their hands reaching out for her. Sarah dodged and weaved through the aisles of the church, trying to stay ahead of the dead. She could hear the priest's voice, urging her to keep moving, to keep fighting. And then, she was at the back of the church, and she saw a window. She quickly unlocked it and climbed out, her feet pounding on the pavement as she ran. She didn't stop running until she reached the outskirts of the city, and then she finally collapsed, exhausted. She looked back, and she saw the city in the distance, consumed by the dead. She knew that she couldn't stay there, that she had to keep moving. And so, she got up and started walking, not sure where she was going, but knowing that she had to keep moving, to keep fighting, if she was going to survive. For days, Sarah wandered through the wilderness, constantly on the run from the dead. She survived on berries and wild game, her knife her only weapon against the relentless horde that pursued her. At night, she huddled in abandoned buildings, listening to the sounds of the dead as they shuffled by outside. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but she pushed on, driven by an indomitable will to survive. One night, she stumbled upon an old cabin in the woods, and she decided to take refuge there for the night. She was cautious as she approached, her hand tight around the knife, but the cabin appeared to be abandoned. She went inside and lit a fire, grateful for the warmth and light. She sat by the fire, her thoughts wandering as she gazed into the flames. And then, she had a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, coming closer and closer. She quickly stood up, her knife at the ready, and she saw a figure emerging from the darkness. It was a man, his clothes torn and ragged, his eyes haunted. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer, but instead held out a hand, offering her a small vial of liquid. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then she took the vial and uncorked it, taking a small sip. And then, everything changed. The world around her shifted, and she saw things that she couldn't possibly have imagined. The dead were no longer mindless zombies, but people, trapped in a world of darkness and despair. She saw the woman in white, and she finally understood. The woman was trying to tell her something, to show her the truth. And then, the world shifted back, and the man was gone. Sarah sat there, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She knew that she had been given a gift that would change her life forever. Sarah found herself at a cabin in the woods one night, having stumbled upon it while trying to escape the relentless pursuit of the dead. She cautiously approached, knife in hand, but the cabin appeared to be abandoned. Inside, she lit a fire and sat down to rest. But just as she was starting to relax, she heard a sound that chilled her to the bone. The sound of footsteps getting closer. Rising to her feet, she saw a figure emerge from the darkness. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes and with haunted eyes. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. The man didn't answer, but instead held out a small vial of liquid. Sarah was hesitant, but after a moment of consideration, she took the vial and drank from it. As soon as she did, the world shifted. The dead were no longer mindless zombies, but people trapped in a world of darkness and despair. Sarah saw the woman in white and finally understood the message she was trying to convey. The world shifted back, and the man was gone. Sarah sat in shock, trying to process what had just happened. She knew she had been given a gift, a new purpose to uncover the truth and bring light back to the world. Sarah left the cabin the next morning, her mind full of questions and her heart filled with a newfound determination. She knew that she had been given a purpose, a mission to uncover the truth about the world and the creatures that lived in it. She traveled for years, searching for answers, learning everything she could about the dead and the forces that drove them. She encountered others like herself, people who had been given the gift of seeing the truth, and she joined forces with them, working together to uncover the secrets of the world. And eventually, they succeeded. They discovered the source of the darkness that had consumed the world, and they found a way to fight back against it. They brought light back to the world, and they gave the dead a chance to rest, to finally be free from their eternal torment. Sarah never forgot the lessons she learned, the horrors she faced, and the people she met. She dedicated her life to helping others, to spreading the truth, and to making the world a better place. And as she stood there, looking out over the world she had helped to save, she knew that she had done the right thing, that she had fulfilled her purpose, and that she had found her place in the world.